how could we introduce arrays and objects here? Well, let's say we want to log every operation we do. So when we add, when we subtract, when we multiply, we kind of want to log this. We want to store this in an internal log, which we theoretically could send to a server or anything like that. In Node.js, we could write it to a file. In the browser, we can't because we don't have access to the file system there for security reasons. But we might want to keep track of that, right? Because we want to store it on our own analytics server, for example. Now, in such a case, we want to keep track of a list of operations because we're not just interested in the first click on the add button, but we want to store every click on every button, and therefore we need to have a list of data that gets bigger and bigger over time. For that, we can add a new global variable here, and I will create it here with the let keyword and name it log entries. The name is totally up to you, of course. Again, it should be a name that kind of gives an idea of which kind of data you're going to store. And it's a plural name here because I'll have multiple elements in there, because it should be such an, well, array, as I mentioned. Now you create an array by adding square brackets, and it can either be an empty array or of course an array with some initial data, and there each element is separated from the other elements by a comma. Typically you also add a white space to improve readability, but that's not required. The comma, however, is required. Now here I want to have an empty array though, because initially we have no log entries and therefore we can create it just like this. Now if we want to add a log entry, let's say when we click the add button here, we could say we go down there and now we want to edit this array and add a new entry. Now, how can we do that? Well, we can refer to log entries. And now previously, we always assigned a new value by setting this equal to a new value. Now, of course, we can set it equal to a new value here as well. And here, the new value would be a new array because I want to overwrite the existing empty array. And therefore, of course, we could also leave this uninitialized with a new array, which now includes, let's say, the entered number, right? So now we set this to a new array, a new list of data with one element, and that one element is this entered number which we have. Now that's one way of editing an array. We basically overwrite the array stored in the variable with a brand new array, and sometimes that's just what you need, but sometimes you also want to edit the existing one. And for that, let's reinitialize this to an empty array up there. Let's say we want to add a new element to this existing array. For that, we can reach out to this array and not assign a new value with the equal sign, but instead use a dot to use a function that belongs to the array, so to say. And there's a specific function built into JavaScript, and that's the push function. Now, actually, arrays have way more than just a push function, and I have a whole module dedicated to arrays where we dive way deeper into them. For now, let's focus on the push function. The push function does what the name implies. It pushes a new element onto this array. So it adds a new element to the list. And there we could say that should be the entered number. Now, it would be kind of neat to see that array. And for now, we can do something which you will often do during development. You can add console log here, and that's a built-in functionality built into JavaScript, a built-in command which the browser understands, which allows you to output something into that development console, into the console which you see in the developer tools, where we previously saw some errors. Now here we're not outputting an error, but an information log message. And here we can, for example, log the log entries, so the value that's currently in that variable, which should be that array with one extra element if we run this for the first time. And after the second click, it should have two elements because we always push a new one. Let's see. Let's save that. Open the developer tools in your browser and go to the console there, reload the page, and now enter any number you want and click on the plus. And of course you see the result down there, but more interesting than that, you see this thing on the right here. That is your array. And if I add another value, so if I click the plus again, you see now, this is the new log. This now is a new array, or the old array with an extra element to be precise. You see we have two elements in there separated by commas, in this case two numbers, but again, you could store any data in the array, and therefore that's what we have in there. And this is a great way of keeping track of multiple items, multiple pieces of data that are kind of belonging together and that should be managed as a list of data. Now, if you want to read from the array, in the sense of not logging it entirely, but let's say you want to extract the first element that's in there, so the 5 in this case, well then you can also do that. If you want to access a specific element in the array, you do this by adding square brackets after the variable name if you access the variable. So in a place where you want to get or read the variable, you can also add square brackets thereafter. And now in there, you add the index, so the position, so to say, of the element you want to extract. Now you could think that you add 1 here if you want to read the first value, but this will actually not work. Because that's just something you have to know, but thankfully it's the case in pretty much all programming languages, or in most programming languages, arrays are 0-based, or their index is 0-based, which means the first element in an array has an index of 0. So if you want to access specifically the first element, you want to retrieve that to work with it, then you do this with this square bracket notation and then with index 0. Index 1 would refer to the second element, index 2 to the third, well, and so on, and index 0 therefore to the first one. That's just how it works in many programming languages. So now what we should see when we log this is that we don't log the entire array, but a single value of the array, to be precise, always the first element in the array. So if I now reload this and now I add, let's say 6 here, you see I log 6, not as an array, so without the square brackets, but just a number, because that's what we're retrieving. And retrieving, by the way, does not mean that we destroy the array. It's still there, it's still managed in memory. I'm just reading a single value from there. Because that's also something you need quite often in programming, that you have a list of data, but then for a specific operation, you want to work with one specific entry of that list. And again, as so often, we'll of course also see examples for that throughout the course. So that's how you can add a new element to an array. By the way, if you would try to read the second element, so the one with index 1 here, we would actually get an error here in this code, because when I reload this, when I add a new element here, you see I now get undefined, so not an error technically, but also not the value we expected. Because of course this already fires for the first element we added, so when I clicked the button for the first time, and there we simply have no second element in the array yet, because we only added one value, so we pushed one value into the array, so there only is one value in there, and as you learned, that one value has the index of 0. Only after the second button click, we have 2 values in there, and then we can retrieve a value with index 1, which is the second element. So now if I add another element here, now this gets logged. And if I add a third one, I of course still get 11 logged here, because I still extract the second element, and that's still the element we added on the second click. So that's arrays. We can manage lists of data with them. There's way more we can do with them than just push and access single elements. But again, that's also something we'll gradually learn throughout the course, because we also need some other things, some other pieces of knowledge before we can fully unleash their power. They're already quite nice like this though to manage lists of data.